Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you critical discussions with thought leaders in defense, security, and global affairs. I'm your host, Josh Malm. The CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through our events, research, and publications. Today, Michael Ohanlan, J. Michael Kuo, Raymond Kuo, and Scott Simon join us to discuss cross-strait relations. In particular, tensions that have risen over the past several months and China's recent military exercises near Taiwan, historical trends, potential invasion scenarios, Taiwan's defense capabilities, and the broader geopolitical implications of the tensions between China and Taiwan. This is the Expert Series. Differences over Taiwan's status have fueled rising tensions between the island and the mainland over the past few months. Just this week, China threatened the death penalty for quote-unquote die-hard Taiwan independence advocates, despite having no jurisdiction over the island. Taiwan's Mainland Affairs Council dismissed the threat, stating that Chinese laws have no binding force on its people and urging them not to be intimidated by Beijing's actions. Over 1 month ago, China conducted 2 days of military exercises around Taiwan for the island's quote-unquote separatist acts, following the inauguration of President Lai. The drills, which Taiwan condemned as irrational provocations, included full-scale attack simulations, and some experts say they were aimed to demonstrate that Taiwan's east coast was vulnerable to Chinese military action. This escalation highlights ongoing tensions between China, which views Taiwan as a breakaway province, and Taiwan, which sees itself as a distinct sovereign state. Since the election of former Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen in 2016, tensions between Taiwan and China have intensified. Tsai rejected the cross-strait formula endorsed by her predecessor, which aimed at enhancing relations between the two sides. In response, Beijing has escalated its actions, including conducting flights of fighter jets near the island. Analysts have expressed concerns that a potential Chinese attack on Taiwan could lead to a conflict involving the United States and China, which would have global implications. Today, our experts will discuss these topics and more. First, we'll turn to Michael Ohanlan, Director of Research and Senior Fellow of the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. Michael, great to have you on today. Thanks for coming. So how can we understand current tensions in the Taiwan Strait, particularly in light of China's recent drills, which took place a little over 1 month ago now?
Tensions have been worsening in the Taiwan Strait for years, on and off, certainly going back to even the late 90s and early 2000 aughts, when some more pro-autonomy / pro-independence leaders took power in Taiwan, and China responded then and fired missiles into the sea. But at that point, China didn't have nearly the military capability or economic clout that it does now. And so also the United States helped persuade Taiwan leaders to walk back a little bit of their pro-independence rhetoric. We had a relatively quieter period in much of the 2010s with a Taiwanese president who was from the opposite political party than the one holding power now. And he was in favor of improving cross-strait relations and downplaying the whole independence debate, maybe even, hypothetically exploring some broader form of confederation eventually. But the presidency of Ma ended, of course, as all presidencies do in a democracy. And since that time, we've now had 3 straight elections where the DPP party was elected to power in Taiwan, including President Lai, now in office a week, having won the election earlier this year and succeeding his previous boss, President Tsai. And so that party has been in favor of promoting Taiwan independence, or at least has had historical roots in doing so. And even if they say they're not going to promote it now, it's often with the caveat that why bother promoting something we've already got? In other words, that they're trying to find a recipe by which they can basically say they're already independent and therefore don't need to declare it or do what Beijing would consider a red line. The reason I give all that long history to answer your question is I don't know how to understand anything that's happening today without that history in mind, because President Lai's inauguration speech last week was not that bad. You had to be looking for trouble to find anything provocative in that speech. And China was looking for trouble because of this history, because of the history where for a long time they've insisted Taiwan's an inherent core part of the mainland, a true vital interest of mainland China, for which Beijing would be prepared to make a decision to go to war if necessary. But they have historically been willing to wait out some kind of a attempt at a formula of broad affiliation, confederacy, call it what you will, that both sides could live with, partly because they didn't have the military means to force any other change. And now we're entering a more complex era where they may have the military capability, although certainly there's no guarantee they'd succeed. And certainly it could be a very costly war that could cost them a lot, not just in terms of military losses, but economic losses around the world. If China were to attempt this, I think they'd be severely punished. But anyway, nonetheless, they don't want to let go of this aspiration. And President Xi Jinping himself, of course, seen as a more strong-armed leader, a leader now into his third term in China, which is unprecedented since, the modern era going back to Deng Xiaoping. He seems to be a leader who wants to put himself up on a pedestal with Mao as someone who accomplished great things for the country. And one way to measure that kind of historical excellence might be through China's raw economic power, but another may be by completing the reunification of the country as they see it. So that's the broad context. Now, I don't really think China wants to try an all-out war, and President Lai's speech certainly was not bad enough to necessitate that in anybody's book. But China wants to create a psychological sense of coercion and of momentum such that maybe over time, people in Taiwan lose heart and concede some kind of Hong Kong-like affiliation, or maybe the United States and its key Western partners, to include Canada, decide that it's just not worth the risks of World War III to protect this small island of 23 million people, especially if we can wean ourselves off of its high-end semiconductors in the next decade. So China, I think, is more interested in eating away at Taiwan's confidence, at the world's mettle and willingness to risk war to protect Taiwan, and therefore the sort of dial up the rheostat, more or less uses of non-lethal force become its go-to way of advancing its agenda. That's a lot packed into one answer, but I don't think there's really any other way to understand it except with that kind of historical perspective.
In what ways could this military exercise be seen as a test or legitimate preparation on China's part for a potential future blockade or invasion? And do you think China will be capable of actually carrying out an invasion within the decade? There's obviously much debate on this topic.
Well, again, I'm cognizant of the fact that I'm speaking to Canadian friends, at least many of the listeners of this podcast, because Canada, the United States, and Britain just 80 years ago, of course, carried out the D-Day landings against a beach that they had spent months bombing, and across a channel that they had spent years figuring out how to dominate in every conceivable way, such that German military power could not infringe on the crossing of the channel, such that German air power would have no chance in the skies. And even so, it was still a very hard fight coming ashore, as the brave Americans, Canadians, and Brits who gave their lives or risked their lives in that crossing know all too well. And those who remember them on this Memorial Day in the United States, in fact, if you'll permit me to note that we're taping this on May 27th. With all that said, the reason I give that historical perspective is that it was hard enough for us to do this 80 years ago when we owned the airspace and the waterways around the entire combat zone, and when we had the combined military power of the United States, Britain, and Canada against a weakened Germany that was also fighting the Soviets on the eastern flank. So China may be a lot bigger than Taiwan, but it's got to cross 100 miles of water in an era where we now have precision strike weaponry, smart sea mines, and other ways of making any such attempted crossing even harder than D-Day was for the Allies 80 years ago. I personally think that if we do our jobs right, and by we, I mean primarily Taiwan itself, but also the United States and Japan, and perhaps other countries like Australia and Canada. But if we do our jobs right in preparing the right kind of weaponry and the right kind of redundant, survivable sensor networks and communications networks, that China should not be capable of carrying out a successful amphibious assault with high confidence anytime into the future. I think it should be a bridge too far. Keep throwing out my World War II recollections and metaphors. It's just really hard in the modern era to carry out amphibious assault when the enemy knows you're coming and the enemy has prepared defensive positions. And Taiwan is notoriously hard to assault because it has a lot of either mountainous cliffs along the seacoast or long, muddy tidal flats that are hard to traverse, even in the best of times. So that part of the mission, I think we should be able to handle collectively. And I don't think the Chinese are going to risk that. However, I'm much less optimistic about stopping a Chinese blockade of Taiwan, to get to the way you phrase your question, because in this kind of a scenario, if China decides to start sinking the occasional ship going into Taiwan and just try to essentially strangle Taiwan economically, then the onus now becomes on us, the allies, and plus Taiwan, to break that blockade by creating a safe shipping corridor for big vessels coming in and out of Taiwan ports. And all the military challenges that China would have faced in the amphibious assault, protecting big, large objects in an era of precision strike and 360-degree, 24-hour intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. All those challenges now accrue to us because we're the ones that have to stop the Chinese subs operating underwater or the Chinese missiles from finding and sinking big ships, be they military vessels or commercial ships. And so I think the blockade scenario is a very interesting one for China, which doesn't have to be undertaken with the same sense of all or nothing. You can dial it up, dial it down. And these missile firings are, in a sense, a harbinger or a suggestion of how that kind of actual blockade attempt might be conducted. For example, next time, instead of just landing a few missiles in the vicinity of Taiwan, as China also did in August 2022 after the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi's visit, China could land a few missiles right inside of harbors, Taiwan harbors, and maybe even do it at night so there aren't many people around, but have a couple of them hit some of the cranes that are used in Taiwan's import-export business and damage, the infrastructure needed to carry on economic activity, and also imply that this could get worse with an even greater use of force if Taiwan doesn't desist from whatever activity China's decided that it finds unacceptable. So that's the set of scenarios that I worry about the most. And I've done some detailed military modeling where I've at least convinced myself, maybe not all my readers, but at least myself, that there's no way to know who would win this kind of a war if it were fought out between China on the one hand and Taiwan, the United States, and possibly some other allies on the other.
Thanks, Michael. Great to have you on. Now we'll turn to J. Michael Cole, a Taipei-based senior non-resident fellow with the MacDonald Laurier Institute based in Ottawa. Michael, thanks for joining us again. Good to have you on the program. What would you say prompted China's most recent round of military drills? I'm wondering if you can outline Beijing's thinking, objectives, or strategy here.
Certainly. Well, first of all, I think we need to be careful when we use the term prompted to describe what China did last week. It was preordained. We have seen over the past, 2 years or so, there's continuous PLA exercises around Taiwan, some of which getting increasingly close to Taiwan. And this is all part of, China's strategy to put pressure on Taiwan. So there's a component that certainly is psychological warfare, because we know that ultimately China would like for Taiwan to simply give up and agree to sit down, negotiate with Beijing on terms that obviously would be dictated by Beijing. There is a tendency to describe the larger military maneuvers as a reaction to something, or that being prompted by something that either Taiwan did or United States did, or NATO or G7 said something favorable to Taiwan, and therefore poor Beijing was compelled to react. The thing is, we're currently in the optimal season in the Taiwan Strait when it comes to weather conditions or exercises. So the period between end of April until August is the best time during which the PLA can conduct maneuvers. And it has done that over the years. Oftentimes, propagandists in Beijing from PLA, Taiwan Affairs Office, or academics will say, well, this is a signal to Taiwan, this is a warning to Taiwan, or this is in reaction to this and that. Whereas in reality, most of those exercises are simply routine exercises. Now, there's no doubt that what we saw last week was on a larger scale than what we normally see, except back in April last year and certainly August 2022 when Nancy Pelosi, then U.S. House Speaker, visited Taiwan. But at the same time, Taiwan has a new president whom Beijing certainly dislikes. And they had already decided that whatever he said during his inauguration would not be good enough for them. And therefore, they would have to react. So all that to say that these exercises were planned well before President Lai even opened his mouth upon becoming Taiwanese president, because they wanted to send that signal. The other thing as well, certainly, is that these exercises familiarize Chinese pilots and naval officers with the environment around Taiwan. So certainly there is a training component as well, so they can learn about the environment surrounding Taiwan, uh, and learn from those experiences as well. And the other component as well is for the Chinese side to try to, they're monitoring Taiwanese reactions. They're monitoring American, Japanese reactions as well. So, which air defense batteries have been activated, how do they communicate, which type of aircraft is being scrambled. So they're also monitoring Taiwan's reactions and strategies in response to these exercises.
Now, I'm simplifying for the sake of this discussion, but I think broadly we could say that there are two camps on the topic of an invasion. One that says it's too costly and logistically challenging for China, and the other that an invasion is imminent, and after Putin's invasion of Ukraine, we just can't count on a world leader or state to act rationally, or that in the least their actions can't always be predicted. Obviously, this isn't a new phenomenon, but Ukraine is a more recent example. In any case, where do you stand on this topic?
Yeah, that's an ongoing debate. Certainly what happened in Ukraine in February 2022 changed calculations for a lot of people, because prior to Russia invading Ukraine, a lot of people in government, a lot of people in Europe and think tanks also said that ultimately Vladimir Putin was bluffing, that he is rational, the costs would be too high, and therefore he will not launch an invasion of Ukraine. Well, we all know what happened. They crossed the border and they did invade Ukraine. Now, that is certainly not a perfect analogy, and certainly not evidence that Xi Jinping would make the same calculations. We also know that crossing a land border is far easier than launching an amphibious assault against Taiwan. Transiting hundreds of thousands of soldiers across the Taiwan Strait would be an immensely difficult and costly endeavor for which Taiwan has been preparing for 7 decades, not to mention possible American intervention and all that. So the costs for Beijing, and there's been different tabletop exercises over the years. In any scenario, there's no clear winner. In any scenario, it's devastating for all the players involved, including the Chinese. So there's thousands upon thousands of dead Chinese as well. So all that to say, we cannot take for granted that China would do that. We know for a fact that Xi Jinping has given the order for the PLA to have the capabilities to do so if called upon by 2027. But oftentimes people see that date and they seem to conclude that that's the year that China will invade Taiwan. There's actually no document or order that we are aware of in Beijing that says that China will invade in 2027. That decision would also be contingent on the international environment, whether Beijing is convinced that the United States would not intervene, that Japan would not intervene, Taiwan is sufficiently isolated and not prepared enough to counter that kind of invasion. All that being said, for Taiwan and its partners, they also need to make sure that they are prepared and they have the capabilities to respond to that kind of scenario if it were to occur. Because if you're caught unawares, it's going to be absolutely catastrophic for Taiwan. And we are, one final point, we need to bear in mind that we're dealing with an ultra-personalistic authoritarian leader with a very, very small circle of advisors around here, much smaller than it was under Xi Jinping's predecessors in Beijing. So he's megalomaniac. He has this sense of destiny. And he doesn't seem to be receiving the input that he might need to make enlightened decisions over matters such as war and peace. So even if the possibility that China would do the unthinkable remains rather small for the time being, Taiwan and partners need to prepare for that scenario and continue to augment deterrence so that Xi Jinping's calculations are that we want him to continue to think that it would be too costly. It would be destabilizing for China, for the economy, and ultimately would probably lead to the collapse of Chinese Communist Party. This is what you want people in Beijing to be thinking.
Michael, could you describe some of the logistical challenges China would need to address for a successful invasion? I'm wondering also if you might be able to describe what defensive measures Taiwan has in place to counter potential blockades or invasions.
Well, for an invasion scenario, but under most assessments, the first phase, other than saturating Taiwan with missiles, naval bases, and all that, chances are China would also need to knock off U.S. capabilities in the region. So that means air or missile attacks against bases in Okinawa and sea denial behind Taiwan, so that forces from Hawaii and Guam would also not be able to enter. That opens up Pandora's box, because if you start launching attacks on physical bases in Japan, very likely that would be considered an act of war by the Japanese government, and would result in certain reactions by Japanese, possibly would also trigger the treaty alliance with the United States. So eliminating those capabilities would also increase the risks that for China that United States and Japan will become involved. And if that is the case, that further complicates China's ability to seize Taiwan. That's one thing. The largest challenge by far is that if you want to occupy Taiwan, you need to put boots on the ground. You cannot win simply by launching missiles and using aircraft or drones or whatnot. You need to put boots on the ground. Usually, under most calculations, for any invading force, you need a ratio of 3-to-1 soldiers. So you are against defending forces, which means, anywhere above 150,000, 170,000 Chinese PLA soldiers would need to be brought physically on Taiwan. Now, the largest challenge, as we know, is the amphibious assault part, is bringing those soldiers to Taiwan. For that, you need large surface vessels, whether it's military carriers, or there's also talk of China using commercial aircraft and cargo not aircraft, sorry, but vessels and transport vessels to bring soldiers to Taiwan. Those are very slow. The number of beaches that are suitable for that around Taiwan is quite limited, and those are areas that the Taiwanese military and the American military and the Japanese military long ago identified. And for that, Taiwan has been developing hypersonic anti-ship cruise missiles. They're the Xiongfeng 2, Xiongfeng 3 missile. They're road mobile, they're road launched, they're ship launched, and increasingly put on smaller dispersible surface combatants in Taiwan as well. So all that to say, there's no way that China could eliminate all these capabilities, which means that those capabilities would continue to exist to sink vessels that are transporting troops to Taiwan. So again, you're talking, probably tens of thousands of Chinese victims. China is also banking on aircraft carriers. Again, those are prime targets for all types of anti-ship missiles. If you start bringing those capabilities in the West Pacific behind Taiwan, they're also exposed to American submarines. So there's a lot of complexity in just bringing those soldiers to Taiwan, and logistically, to be able to do that, you would have several months ahead of an invasion for Taiwan and American intelligence to detect that China is getting ready to do something. So the notion that China can launch a surprise attack on this scale is absolutely unthinkable. So the moment we start seeing signs that China is preparing for that, then the Taiwanese side and allies would also prepare for that contingency. Then the final element as well is that once you've put boots on the ground, you need to pacify a country that has extraordinarily difficult terrain, from dense urban areas to mountainous areas. And more Taiwanese special forces and reserve forces are training for that as well. So now China would also need to wage a war of pacification against 23 million people, against hardened targets, and more training for civilians as well, who could learn some skills to try to complicate the lives of occupied forces. So these are all things that make that kind of scenario not nightmarish for Chinese forces. And again, at the end of the day, would China prevail? Probably, but it would be at such a high cost that Chinese leaders would probably think twice about attempting that. So that means that a blockade against Taiwan is a likelier, it certainly would be a less costly scenario. But that being said, given where Taiwan is situated geographically, it would be impossible to isolate Taiwan or to blockade Taiwan in a vacuum of the other large economies and global trade around Taiwan. So the notion that China could sustain a blockade long enough that Taiwan would give up is difficult to imagine, because very soon you would start affecting the Japanese economy, South Korean economy, Philippines, and ultimately global economy. So that would become increasingly a regional and a global issue as well. And more capabilities would likely be brought to bear to counter blockades, what China is doing against Taiwan.
Michael, thanks again for joining me. Hope to have you on again soon. Next, we'll turn to Raymond Kuo, inaugural director of the RAND Corporation's Taiwan Policy Initiative and a senior political scientist at RAND. Raymond, thanks for joining me today. As an observer of cross-strait relations, what would you say is the significance of China's most recent military drills near Taiwan?
The thing that jumps out to me the most is that the bar for what counts, for what triggers exercises of the scale, is really, really low. I know the Taiwan Affairs Office, the Foreign Minister Wang Yi, we're all kind of lambasting Lai's speech for being, separatist, seeking independence, and that kind of thing. Really, I mean, you actually read the speech, and it's available in English as well. There's nothing in there. There's real, you have to squint really hard to see that, or read the tea leaves. But to some extent, I think that framing has gotten some traction. But I think it does a disservice because that the fact that it's gaining traction is a disservice because it really wasn't very much. And using that as a pretext to justify these massive exercises, I mean, to some extent, I think that, the bar is just set very, very low. And to some extent, I think that's actually beneficial for Taiwan, in part because it means that it has an easier time saying to other countries in the world, look, we didn't say anything, and they're bracketing us in military exercises. You should be supporting us in this conflict and in this competition.
How prepared is China to actually undertake an amphibious invasion of Taiwan?
Yeah, I tend to think that the kind of the soft blockades exercise is not really a great way to test that. The mission set's quite different, right? If you're going to have an amphibious invasion, well, you need to be, the things that you want to kind of look at are your ability to mass forces quickly and undercover so that the Taiwanese are not preparing. You can catch somebody off guard. Whether that's ships or aircraft, either way, it's going to be a fairly big effort. And so the naval exercises that we see, and I haven't heard of any live fire exercises. I think there was a kind of a drill, but I don't know if there was actually anything shot. These are better for practicing a blockade rather than like an invasion. Having say aircraft carriers on the eastern side of Taiwan in the event of an invasion is not really a great idea. The PLA fighters and planes can just already cover the range anyway, so you don't really gain that much. And then you have to worry about a submarine other engagement for your carrier outside in the deeper waters out there. So stationing ships around, especially on the eastern side of it, it's that doesn't seem to me to be that useful in an invasion scenario.
What is the current military balance between China and Taiwan, and has it undergone any shifts in the past decade?
I mean, the answer is yes. We can expect a shift. I think, the Taiwanese, but also very much so the United States, haven't been slow to understand that we are in a military competition with China. It doesn't mean that we can't hopefully cooperate with the Chinese in other areas, but certainly in terms of the military balance, it's been shifting in the Chinese's favor for quite some time. Specifically in terms of Taiwan, I think, and kind of answering your the second question, they are on track to produce. I can never quite remember the number. I think it's 200 to 400 anti-ship missiles a year. Some of those things, we in the United States could do more to help out with that sort of technology. Not so much the production side, but also kind of upgrading capabilities. The Taiwanese just tested and successfully tested a indigenously developed anti-air missile. And so again, licensing or subcontracting, some sort of technology exchange, sharing would be, I think, very helpful there. The main issue is the weakness of the U.S. defense industrial base. We're just not producing enough. And it doesn't help that, I can't say anything about that. So we're just not producing enough. And I think part of it is funding. Not so much we're not spending enough on the defense industrial base, but we're not spending enough. We're not giving them enough stability long term, right? We can't go to some Northrop Grumman and say, "Hey, we want you to try on this factory." Like, okay, for a year or for 10 years, that length of time really does matter to them. So I think, belatedly, there's a lot of catch up to do, but hopefully the military balance is shifting back a little bit more in Taiwan's favor, at least when it comes to countering an invasion. A blockade, I don't. Yeah, the military balance is kind of fairly far tilted. Taiwan is producing a lot of asymmetric platforms, but it is also still pursuing symmetric platforms like indigenously developed submarine, and purchasing major platforms from the United States like F-16 Block Vs, Abrams tanks. They're going to have some role in a counter invasion scenario, but the bulk of Taiwan's focus should really be on these asymmetric capabilities. Now, I think the Taiwanese do have a point, though, that they need a lot of these symmetric platforms to counter gray zone coercion. So that I'm actually quite sensitive to. And I think that's where the United States can really help out. The more we can help the Taiwanese in terms of demonstrating presence or, giving them, kind of carrying them through that sort of capability gap, I think the easier it is for them to focus on the asymmetric defense.
It seems like there's one camp of people that thinks, well, we might be able to expect China to be a rational actor, that they won't invade Taiwan. The logistical challenges are too great, and the immediate and long-term repercussions would be too devastating. There's another camp that says, well, after Russia invaded Ukraine, when not many analysts thought they would, we need to prepare for a hot kinetic conflict in the region. So what camp would you find yourself in? And is there an imminent need to prepare for such a scenario?
So there's the Davidson window, right? That war is going to happen by 2027. I don't actually think that. I don't think. And someone recently said, "Oh, it's not like Xi Jinping has a calendar on his wall. It's the date circles. Like we got to hit that date. That's the date we're going to go." I think that the Davidson window is something that Americans say to we say to ourselves, and that's really the policy conversation. And I think it's an unhelpful one. This is not to discount that there is a competition and that the U.S. needs to take it seriously, but I think the idea that war is on a set timetable and where it's already kind of been planned, I think that is unrealistic. But when it comes to the rationality of Xi Jinping, so one thing I do worry about is that we think about Vladimir Putin, right? He didn't start off this way, right? By all accounts, he was a fairly mediocre KGB agent in East Germany, and Boris Yeltsin plucked him out to be as his running mate, and then it was only over time that he consolidated power and then killed off a lot of his rivals. And it was over the course of at least 10, 15 years that he became more of this sort of paranoid, we might say irrational actor. So Xi Jinping has done a good job of consolidating his control, but I don't think he's gotten to the point of the social isolation. It's not helpful to me in a broad sense that he's kind of reduced the party's leverage over himself. I think China has gone from a party-led authoritarian system into a more personalistic dictatorship in the political science sense. And so, give him 10 years, maybe he'll turn into a Putin-style kind of paranoid individual. But unfortunately, I think there's very little that we in the United States can do to stop that, or really anybody, right? It's ultimately kind of just up to Xi Jinping himself.
Raymond, thank you once again for joining me. To close out today's episode, we'll turn to Scott Simon, co-holder of the Chair of Taiwan Studies at the University of Ottawa. Scott, nice to have you on today. What was the domestic reaction in Taiwan to China's most recent military drills?
Okay, for the domestic reaction here in Taiwan, since where I'm located, we should probably say that. Well, first of all, there was, of course, the government reaction, which was immediately saying that this is an escalation and that it's unacceptable. But I think if you're talking about the person on the street, they're rather accustomed to Chinese saber rattling. So there wasn't really greater concern, I think, than there would have been at other times. They're just so accustomed to seeing in the news that there are military jets flying around Taiwan, and that there are different gray zone threats to Taiwan. And so actually people were much more concerned about the protests happening in Taipei after that, because of the issues going on in the legislative yuan.
What are the specific changes in the legislative package that was recently pushed by the KMT, and how would you say they could potentially shift power from the presidency to the legislature?
Yeah, so basically there are quite a number of issues that are going through the legislative yuan right now. And so there's a proposal to expand the power of the legislature, and that would give legislators more power to approve or not approve the appointment of officials. It would allow them to conduct investigations, organizations, parts of the government, military, police, even NGOs. And they talk about a number of controversies that have come up in the past few years, things that might seem rather mundane to us, like the price of eggs, but they're thinking about, ways of interrogating government officials. The law, it has passed now, the law would hold them in contempt of the legislative yuan for not complying, even asking questions back to the legislators. And this could lead up to very high fines, so up to 300,000 NT dollars. And there's concern about what that would mean if, could they get in trouble, for example, if they asked back to the person questioning, well, what do you mean by that question? So there's a question about that. There's also an attempt to use this to push through some very major infrastructure projects. One of them is a highway which they would like to build between Puli and Ohanlan. So basically just tunneling through the mountains in the central mountain chain, which would be a huge engineering feat. And then also a high-speed railroad down the East Coast, which now has regular and quite good railroad service. So what they're going to do is create these new infrastructure projects. And I think there's a particular legislator from Hualien who is behind that. I think it was Fu Kunshi. But those are infrastructural projects which would be rather dangerous, I think, in Taiwan because of the prevalence of typhoons on the East Coast, along with earthquakes like we just saw last month, and typhoons, landslides. So there are really major environmental challenges there for the construction and for the maintenance of it, which would be very expensive going forward. But maybe that's part of it. Maybe they want to set aside a huge budget for this, which would make it harder for them to make some of the investments they need in defense.
Taiwan, of course, had an election a few months ago, a very high-profile one. Scott, I'm wondering if you might be able to talk about how Taiwan manages any threats or attempts at what we might call election interference or gray zone tactics. And I wonder if you might be able to dive into some of China's gray zone tactics more generally.
So in terms of election interference, I think that Taiwan is really a good model of how to deal with that. I think that we could see even these gray zone tactics as an attempt to influence the electorate in Taiwan. But they're quite good at using social media to try to influence public opinion. And that's often very, very difficult to track. But I have noticed that there's a online platform that people really like here. It's called Line. And that seems to be, along with TikTok, which everybody knows about, those seem to be platforms in which certain memes are passed around that are sometimes quite explicitly from China, but quite favorable to the way that they would like to see people's imaginations pushed. And so there is some going on, but again, it is very difficult to really pinpoint who is behind some of this. It's not always so obvious. In Taiwan, when it is obvious, it's because the content is from China and it's in the simplified characters from China, and it's people speaking with accents from mainland China. And so those are the times when it's clear.
I'm wondering if you might be able to discuss the new administration's views on cross-strait relations or where it stands and what we think President Lai's approach might be to manage the relationship with China and maybe some of the challenges he's likely to face in the near term.
Yeah, he's definitely going to have some challenges. I think that what we saw in the inauguration address is actually a lot of continuity with what presidents have said in the past. So he mentioned the Republic of China over a dozen times. In Taiwan, unification versus independence is often discussed in the sense that independence would mean declaring a former Republic of Taiwan. And so anybody who proposes instead to keep Republic of China is not considered to be pro-independence. And so that's, basically what he did. He continued to talk about the sovereignty of the Republic of China. We can't forget that he was inaugurated as president of the Republic of China. There was this huge ceremony in which he was made Republic of China president. He cited the Constitution in his inaugural speech by saying the sovereignty of the ROC shall reside in the whole body of citizens. He did refer to China as being a separate country. That's something that China does not like to hear. Ma Ying-jeou, who was not the previous president, but the one before her, liked to say that for him, there's only one China, and that's the Republic of China. And it includes the free area and the mainland area. And so I think that since Tsai Ing-wen, there has been more of a tendency to say ROC Taiwan. But basically they're asking to keep things as they are today. They don't want to push the envelope. And that is not too much unlike Ma Ying-jeou, who said that he was against unification, against independence, and against use of force.
Scott, it's been a pleasure. Thanks again. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Stay tuned this Friday for the latest installment of the Geopolitical Update podcast hosted by Joe Barner. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next time.